The year is 1971. Arnold just won his second Mr. Olympia title uncontested, and like bodybuilders are starting to get massive, with bigger bodybuilders gracing the covers of muscle mags everywhere. And in the gym, there is a new rumor of a new pill, pink or blue they say, that makes your muscles grow like weeds. The name, Dianabol, or D-Bol for short, but not much is known about this little muscle pill. Today I'm going to review one of the few resources available back in the golden era regarding Dianabol, its origin and how to use it. It was regarded as one of the first booklets ever written on anabolic steroids. Hi everybody, Golden Era Booklet here. Today I thought I would review Muscle Building Hormones for Bodybuilders and Athletes by Wayne Galash. For many that are not aware, this is one of the first, or probably the first, specific booklet or book targeted towards bodybuilders regarding the topic of steroids. It was actually published in 1971 by both, even though it's not written here, Wayne Galash and Rude Snodgrass. I've been asked by many people who found out that I obtained a copy of this book, because I used to have a photocopy that Wayne Galash actually sent to me, and now that I've got the real one here, I was asked by several people to review this book because with the whole topic now still going around about steroids and when they were first produced, when they were first used by bodybuilders. I think it's a very historical piece of literature that actually starts in many ways addressing this issue, because it's from back then when I guess the term fake natural or fake natty, as other people would like to say, these terms weren't available. People weren't being called out, and during this time, these steroid hormones were legal, and so there was nothing wrong in calling people out, because in all honesty, you're really not calling anybody out, you're just saying a fact. So I love the unbiased information given here by both Wayne and Rude. At the time of publishing, I have to admit, having read this book, I want to start talking about it. It's very obvious. I'm going to kind of go through some of the pages as I go through my notes here. It's obvious that when I read this, there's Wayne there, by the way, looking super young. He was, of course, a natural powerlifting champion back in the day, with many of his trophies there. And as I read this, it's just a foreword by Rude Snodgrass. It really is a kind of, you see the naivety of the topic of anabolic hormones back then, in how everything has to be literally spelled out, and I kind of understand now that at the time of publishing, 1971 and earlier, because let's be honest, it was published in 1971, but the research was probably done in the 60s and very, very early 70s. It's obvious that the manufacturers and doctors didn't really know much about steroids, and that's very, very obvious here when you read this. This is just an introduction of what testosterone is. As you can read that, when a boy reaches puberty, it starts going about testosterone is carried around the body, and they start developing their masculine traits, right? So it really does slowly introduce the topic of testosterone, and he talks about how manufacturers and doctors didn't really know much about muscle building hormones. It was all their side effects, how they were used. As I said, they were legal, and at most, coaches and athletes, through experimentation and experience with their own athletes, of course, had more experience than doctors did. And in all honesty, not much has changed nowadays in that regard. It's still a very taboo topic, mainly because the drug is still being used. These drugs are still being used experimentally and obtained in the black market now, even though some are, of course, available for therapeutic purposes, which is what their original purpose was. In the 1930s, of course, the book starts off by talking about how they were synthesized in the 1930s, that is testosterone, which had both androgenic and anabolic properties, and therefore produced male characteristics and induced muscle. I'm just reading off my notes now. Of course, muscle growth, that is skeletal muscle growth, used for increasing weight. And it was subsequently found to be useful for increasing weight in debilitated patients, hypogonadic patients, eunuchoids, etc., castrated patients from World War II, which I'm going to talk about in another video. But basically, there's a lot of people saying that the Nazis were using it. This is more or less of a myth. Whether it's true or not, it's hard to say. Some papers nowadays say that this is a myth. Other sources say that it's true. Anyway, I'll go into that in another video. The book points out that testosterone can produce different effects on individuals based on genetics too. But basically, to finish off the idea about, or the topic of castrated patients, yes, I actually have found further information that after the World War, that is after World War II, testosterone was being used definitely as an experimental drug to increase the weight of recovering soldiers. So that's definitely true. Anyway, as I mentioned, testosterone produces different effects on individuals based on genetics, and I like that it actually goes through this, because this is a very important fact. A lot of people, even nowadays, that experiment with worse black market testosterones, or testosterone derivatives, steroids, believe that they're just going to get massive in like hyper responders, which is absolute fallacy. As the book clearly points out, we're talking 50 years ago. It's based on your genetics. And of course, as it continues, two different men may produce the same amount of testosterone. This is a very true point. And look completely different. One may look thin and poorly developed, the other looking more muscular with a very good physique. And the same effect can be seen with the administration of synthetic testosterone. It can have great muscle building effects on one person and do almost nothing for another. And of course, that phenomena I've talked about on my channel already. It's got to do with your genetics and whether you are a hyper responder or not. And that's got to do, of course, with the number of androgenic receptors which you or someone else might be expressing. And this is really key to having an efficient anabolic response to testosterone and its derivatives. Just continuing now. I have to admit, I found the book very interesting to read. It's a small booklet, but nonetheless, being historical and going through the things that I read there, you can really see the naivety, the introduction of the whole idea. It's a very good supporting document, at least for those that really want to state what I believe as well still, that the proliferation of the use really started, one can't even say in the 60s, it really started in the 70s, because even in the 60s, at best, it was experimental. The whole terminology, cycles and all these things like that, milligrams, how much to take, it was grassroots back then. People didn't know this stuff. It was just going to come out with Dianabol, of course, in 1958, 59. Let's continue with my summary here. Pharmaceutical companies, realizing the anabolic and androgenic qualities of testosterone, wanted to create anabolics with lower androgenic side effects, allowing prolonged use. After World War II, as I mentioned earlier, they realized that although testosterone could increase weight in soldiers suffering from severe malnutrition, their testicles shrank and they had other side effects like enlarged prostates caused by androgenic qualities of testosterone. Hence, looked to reduce the androgenic qualities by synthesizing new testosterone derivatives. This is a super important point. I was actually talking to Dante from Natty Life, because I'm going to release a video soon, or it might come out even before this video, regarding the potential use of testosterone in the silver era. And a lot of people don't realize this very important fact. Everybody states it. In 1935, testosterone was synthesized, therefore everybody after that was on test. which is, which in a very small mind that might make sense, but it's not that easy, right? You got to put things into context. At the time, testosterone was at most experimental and used in clinical research. It was found to be very toxic, and this is the point I want to get to. If testosterone was so potent from the get-go, then why would you ever need to synthesize derivatives from it to make it more effective? The whole point is to make it more effective. Why? Because the original product isn't effective. I mean, why reinvent the wheel? This is something most people just can't fathom in their heads, or can't think that far ahead, maybe. Why reinvent the wheel? Obviously, there was something wrong with the synthetic testosterone, and this book really talks a lot about that, and I love that fact. They actually talk a lot about the side effects of early use of testosterone and points to the fact, to the drive, to the need for companies to produce something different that would reduce those side effects. And this is a point most people don't actually realize. Why create Dianabol? Why create Deca? Why create all these other drugs when tests work so well? It didn't work so well. There was lots of side effects. It was very toxic, and the book talks about that brilliantly. So I like that. So this is what led to companies like Ciba then coming out with Dianabol. Initially, I'll just continue reading from my notes. Initially, drug responses began, drug companies, this is another thing they did. They began mixing testosterone with estrogen. Now, I've got that over here somewhere at the back, right? Where it lists all these, here we go. And it even states in there we go. You will probably wish to avoid these. These are the second group of anabolics that are listed, that were available back in the 70s and in the 60s. The manufacturers tried to produce anabolics that would not have an undue androgenic effect by mixing what were fundamentally androgens with what were fundamentally estrogens. So there you go. It's a mix of androgenic hormones like testosterone derivatives with estrogen, and they're listed here. And so you can really start seeing the effects of the androgenic qualities from testosterone, the side effects really, and how at the time they were like, testosterone is not working like we thought it could. We have to reduce the androgenic effects because we're having some pretty toxic side effects here. So let's start. You can start seeing the thought process here. The scientists start thinking maybe if we add female hormones, we'll reduce the androgenic effects. But of course, later on, what that led was to bodybuilders actually developing breasts and things like that. So I'll keep reading. Initially, drug companies began mixing testosterone with estrogen. The estrogen, thinking that the estrogen in the mixture would balance the androgenic qualities of testosterone, as I just said. Instead, it led to development of breasts in subjects, right? Terrible, absolutely terrible. The second approach, of course, and this is great, I keep saying it, I'll repeat it again. We really learn about there's a certain naivety in the whole topic here, and how you really learn about the development, even in the thinking of scientists, as to how to reduce androgenic effects and enhance anabolic effects, right? And there were two approaches, as I already mentioned. One, the mixing of estrogen with testosterone. The second one, the second approach being actually changing the structure of testosterone. And here is where we really learn more about how more effective anabolics came out in the late 50s and early 60s. The second approach involved thinking with the structure of testosterone, which was a rather successful approach. Exactly. You see, suddenly, like Dante from Natty Life showed, a wonderful comparison of magazines of bodybuilders from the 1950s to the 1960s. There's a sudden massive growth in their chest, in their arms. They just look huge in the 60s, whereas in the 50s, they look natural, right? They look awesome. They look, like absolute units, but they're natural. At least, let's just say they're possibly natural at the time. And yeah, like they tried to. It was a successful approach, the second approach of actually changing the structure of testosterone. The point was in trying to reduce the androgenic effects, although no anabolic really was ever going to be totally lacking in androgenic effects. I'm reading from my notes again. The history of dianabol is briefly explained, of course, and its introduction in the late 50s and early 60s into the iron game, with Sieber, of course, pushing the drugs onto the York team through Dr. Ziegler. The dosage recommended in this book at least, is 10 to 40 milligrams, with the latter being called a much more dangerous amount. Galash in the book mentions that others inject and take tablets, and of course, this is also, very dangerous, of course, with terrible side effects. And as he mentions, the bodybuilders that did this back in the 60s and 70s didn't really last long in the bodybuilding circuit, because they were starting to suffer from severe illness, even with these synthetic hormones that had a different structure to testosterone. He also discusses the pros and cons and how to take them, the importance of medical supervision, and having your blood pressure taken, your kidney biochemical values from your blood, of course, your liver function tests, also biochemical values, all pretty standard, of course, knowledge nowadays. Of interest is Galash's description of John Grimmick's many articles on the use of anabolics, you see my notes here, in muscular development in the 1960s. And yes, fortunately, I do have the complete collection of muscular development from the very first issue. And within, there are many articles written by John Grimmick. Why? Because, of course, it reflects his knowledge on the topic of anabolics. Anyone that doesn't really know much about the history of steroids will not understand John Grimmick's role in it. He was one of the initial guinea pigs in the 50s. As many of you should know, he was one of the first bodybuilders to ever experiment with dianabol, under the supervision, of course, of Dr. Ziegler in the late 50s. Before him, of course, or around the same time, was Bill Pearl using Nilevar, also in the mid to late 50s. And there's other topics touched on the importance of supplementing on a high protein diet with lots of vitamins, especially due to the body's increased metabolic demands of protein synthesis under the influence of steroids. So there's all these stuff talked about in this book, and much more that I would love to, of course, talk about, but this video has already been 17 minutes. My take home from this book would be, it's a great little read. Unfortunately, Wayne, I've asked him if I could scan it and put it online, but he refuses. So I've got to respect that. And what I can tell you from what you've heard from this book is that it really offers an insight into the lack of knowledge, as was so clearly described by Wayne and Brood, of anabolics at the time. The naivety of athletes and coaches and everybody, especially doctors and manufacturers. Their only knowledge really was based on what coaches and athletes were doing. The introduction of new derivatives of testosterone were much more successful in creating an anabolic effect. But of course, this goes back to my point. It really proves the fact that, they had to reinvent the wheel. They had to, because testosterone, as explained quite clearly here, was having too much of an androgenic effect, and these effects were very toxic in the body and very unwelcome. Again, I talked about those earlier. Enlarged prostates, shrinking testicles, losing hair, and God knows what else, failing organs, and of course deaths in some circumstances. So it was a very interesting read, a very interesting look at the history of steroids, of testosterone, and its subsequent structural changes that scientists introduced to see if they could make it more anabolic and less androgenic because of its initial toxic side effects. So a fantastic book. Definitely worth a read. I'm glad I read it. I'm glad I'm sharing this information with you guys, which further sheds light, I guess, on the whole history of steroids. People still claim that all the silver era athletes were on, ton loads of testosterone and their physiques are purely based on it, and I don't think that's true. And I'm going to be talking about that very soon. Sure, the possibility of experimentation is there, in my own opinion, but whether their physiques are based or affected by possible experimentation, in my opinion, is still very unlikely. Otherwise, they wouldn't be as vital, as strong, as healthy as they were, right? Again, why reinvent the wheel? If testosterone was so phenomenal, then why would scientists go ahead and start developing things like Dianabol? It doesn't make any sense. Working in science myself, in the medical industry, when something works, you market the hell out of it, right? And you try and make millions or billions of dollars. You don't invest millions or billions in something that's already working very well. Why? Well, yeah, you could, I guess, to make even more products, but testosterone didn't really change much for about 20 years until they started coming out with steroids. And that's when steroids really blew up. Okay, we know what to do now. We just take off a little bit of here and a little bit of there, and the androgenic qualities suddenly disappear, or mostly disappear. And now it can come out with 50 different products and sell them all with different names. Essentially, they all do more or less the same thing, right? And that's how the pharmaceutical industry works. But they were having a lot of problems with testosterone. Now that's very, very obvious after reading this book. So hope you've enjoyed my, I guess, extensive review of muscle building hormones for bodybuilders and athletes by Wayne Galash. If you have, please give the video a thumbs up. Subscribe if you haven't done so yet. Leave me your comments, and thanks for watching. This is the Golden Era Bookworm saying bye for now. Head to www.goldenerabookworm.com for the biggest range of classic old school bodybuilding books as ebooks, e-magazines such as Iron Man and Reg Park Journal, high quality bodybuilding posters of the Golden Era stars, merchandise and classic gymwear featuring Steve Reeves, Marvin Eder, John Grimmick, Reg Park, and many other Golden Era stars. For those wishing to build a classic physique, lose fat, and build muscle, online training is also available. Collectibles such as rare autographed photos from the Golden Era stars are also available, and to collaborate, please get in touch. As a natural bodybuilder, it is imperative to know your own testosterone levels, as they are a reflection of the anabolic environment created by your diet and training. I would highly recommend using the male hormone test kit from Let's Get Checked, and make sure you use my code GOLDEN30 for a 30% discount. Again, the advantage of checking yourself regularly is that you will know how well your body is anabolically primed to put on the much desired muscle you are working for. Not all of us have the time to go to a gym or the opportunity to have a coach to teach us one-on-one, but with the Future Fitness app, it's like having a personal trainer in your living room. From February 11th onwards, you can try the Future Fitness app for only $19 for the first month. Think of what you can accomplish during that first month. So go on and hit my link at tryfuture.co/GEB to get started.